Hey there, welcome to this amazing session where we are going to learn how we can start preparing our jobs microservices to be deployed onto Kubernetes. So if you're watching this video for the first time or if you're new to this channel, I would highly recommend to check out the earlier videos in this particular series because this video is a part of a complete series. And to get a context of the source code that we are using in this lecture, it's really important that you watch the earlier videos as well. Now, how can you find the earlier videos? So for that, you need to head over to the description of this video where you'll find the link to the entire series. Now, talking about what we are going to cover in this particular session, we are going to learn how you can start preparing our microservices to be deployed onto Kubernetes. So there will be a set of configurations that you need to do, and that is exactly what we are going to cover step by step. So this is going to be a complete hands-on session where we will be actually doing things in a hands-on way practically. Now, if you have been watching my videos and if you haven't liked or subscribed yet, I would highly recommend doing so. Because every subscriber or every subscription that I get on my channel motivates me to bring in more such amazing content for you all. The support and love that I get from my viewers impacts my ability to bring in more such amazing free content for you all. So I would highly recommend that you hit the subscribe button, like this particular video and turn on the bell notifications. Also, feel free to leave a comment to let me know what kind of videos I should bring for you all. Now, without a further ado, let's jump right into the session. Hey there, welcome back. So let us start talking about API Gateway and Eureka Server when it comes to Kubernetes. So in traditional microservices architecture, tools like API Gateway and Eureka Server are often used to manage and discover services. Now by Eureka Server, it's a service registry from Netflix suite of tools. Now when transitioning to Kubernetes, many of these functionalities are either built into the platform or can be managed through other tools that are designed to work natively with Kubernetes. So let us talk about each one of them. So a simple answer to this question, like do we need API Gateway and Eureka Server in Kubernetes? The answer would be no, and I'll explain you why. So let us talk about API Gateway. So for API Gateway, there are multiple ways like Kubernetes ingress controllers. So Kubernetes provides ingress controllers to manage external access to services within the cluster. And these controllers can handle load balancing, SSL termination, and path-based routing. So this reduces the need for API Gateway. Instead of this, service mesh can also be used for even more advanced traffic routing options and even fault tolerance and security. Okay, so this negates the need for a traditional API Gateway in the Kubernetes environment. And then talking about Eureka Discovery Server. So service discovery is also managed internally in Kubernetes. So when a service is created, it is automatically discoverable by other services within the cluster using its service name. So this is taken care by Kubernetes itself. So this negates the use of an external API gateway or service discovery for our architecture. But we will be having this on our local environments. So like we have different properties file. So what we can do is we can have API Gateway and Service Registry for our local environments and Docker. But for Kubernetes, we can negate this and we can do without these services. Okay. So to summarize, the core functionalities provided by API Gateway or Service Discovery tool like Eureka either built into Kubernetes or can be supplemented with Kubernetes native tools. And therefore, it's possible to use these tools within Kubernetes environment, but they might add unnecessary complexity since Kubernetes itself provides mechanisms like routing, load balancing, service discovery, and so on. And these are sufficient for most of the use cases. And this negates the need for tools like API Gateway and Eureka Server. So basically, we can get rid of these services in Kubernetes environment. Hey there, welcome back. So let us start with the job microservices, and we will begin setting up the application properties for the Kubernetes environment for our project. So here, as you can see, I have a sample application.properties file, and this is something that I have written for Kubernetes. So we'll move this file to our project and we will discuss the changes. So I'll copy this entirely and I'll head over to my project here. Now here under SRC, I'll go to main resources, and here I'll duplicate this particular file. So let me see whether we have a duplicate option. Okay, so we don't have a duplicate option, so I would rather go ahead and create a new one. Okay, so I'll say new file and I'll say application -k8s and I'll say properties, like so. And I'll paste the contents that I have copied. Okay, so this file is now created in the jobs microservice. Now let us go through like everything that we have done in this particular file. So this particular file is the configuration for the microservice that is to be deployed in the Kubernetes cluster. And this file has various settings related to service discovery, data sources, and so on. Okay, so here to begin with, we have the list of service URLs. And these are the services that our job service will interact with. And in Kubernetes, you will notice that we have directly used the service name. Okay, so you can simply use the service name over here as the host name. Here we have specified the port. We have H2 database, which is disabled. Here we also have Eureka, that is disabled. So here I have made a few changes, as you can see. So I have disabled the Eureka service URL and I have specified the application name as job service. And also here I have said register with Eureka false, fetch registry false. So if you go to the Docker file, your application.properties for Docker, you will see here I have the service URL for Eureka and I'm registering with Eureka and fetching the registry as well. But here I have disabled both of them. Then I have the logging level, which is set to debug, which is fine. And then I have the config server that has been disabled. So we don't even need to use an centralized config server. So in Kubernetes setup, you can make use of config map or secret objects instead. So I've disabled this. Then you have the resilience 4J configuration. And these are for setting up circuit breaker patterns and other resilience patterns for our service. All right. And circuit breakers, like we know, prevent failures from cascading in distributed systems. Okay. And these configurations will control how circuit breakers behave, like how many failure it takes before opening the circuit and so on. So these are all the configurations for that. Then I have the Zipkin configuration and the actuator configuration. So for actuator, I am exposing all the endpoints. And for Zipkin, I am sending the trace data to this particular endpoint over here. Okay. And then I have the Postgres SQL configuration over here. So I'm pointing to this database and I have all the details like username, password, and so on. So this is the configuration file for Kubernetes for job services. All right. So we will save this file and we will go ahead with the next step. Hey there, welcome back. So now is the time to set up the deployment and service for our job microservice. So what we are going to do is we are going to copy this entire file. So this is a notepad that I have written. So I'll copy this entire thing. Okay, so this notepad has the definition. So it has the definition for the deployment file as to what it's supposed to contain. And it also has the definition for the service file as to what it's supposed to contain. So now what I will be doing is I'm going to copy this entire thing, like the entire file. Okay, so these two definitions will be copied and I'll head over to Visual Studio Code. Now here you will see three folders. Bootstrap and services are the main folders that will be running our application. So here under Bootstrap, I'll go to job and I'll say create a new file. Okay, and here I'm going to define the deployment file and the service file for the job microservice. So I'm going to say job-deployment.yaml, like so. And I'll paste the entire file that I had created. Okay, so this has service file as well. So I'll just clean this up. But before that, I'll say job-service.yaml, something like this. So we have deployment and service created. Now what I will do is I'll cut the service part over here and I'll move this to the service.yaml. And here in deployment, I'll just get rid of this until over here. And I'll scroll up and I'll even get rid of this title here. Okay. So we have everything set up. Now let us save these two files. So don't forget to save. And let us talk about what we are doing in this particular file. So deployment file has the configuration for deployment. So we are defining the API version, the kind of Kubernetes object, and the name and the labels. Okay, so this contains the information of the deployment itself, like the name and the label. Then we have the specs, and specs has the number of replicas. So we are keeping the number of replicas to that of 1. We have the template defined over here. Now template defines the blueprint for the pods that will be created by this deployment. Okay, and here under template, you have a spec field or a spec label, which defines the specifications for the containers that will run inside this pod over here. Okay, so the specification says we have one container and its name is job. And we have this particular image that we are pulling in. Image pull policy is always, and it means that it will always pull the image from the registry even if it already exists locally. So you can change this if you wish to. And you have the ports set to 8082. And then you have the environment. So this defines the environmental variables inside the container. And here, since we are saying Spring profiles active, and we are setting it to K8s, which means we'll be enabling a particular configuration, like this particular configuration, when the application runs. And then you have restart policy as always. So if the container crashes, Kubernetes will restart it. And then in the end, we have selector, and this defines how deployment finds which pod to manage. And here it's matching the pod with label app:job. So this is a definition for the deployment file. Now let us talk about the service file or the service configuration. So here, like always, we have API version, kind, and metadata set. Okay, so metadata contains the metadata regarding the service here, because this is a service object and it has the name here. Then we have the specifications defined. So here we are specifying the selector and ports. Now selector is how the service finds which pods to send traffic to. And here it matches the pods with label app:job. Okay. And then here you have ports defined. So this defines the port that service exposes. So the port on which the service will be exposed in this case is 80. And the target port on the pods to which the service will be sent, here it corresponds to that of 8082. So this is the service definition that we have. So Deployment and the service are the two configurations that we need to set up under job folder within K8s folder that we have. And these two will define the Kubernetes configuration for job microservice. Welcome back. So let us now start talking about the properties file for the company microservice. So I've already created the properties file and I've defined it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire file and I'm going to move to IntelliJ. And here I'm going to head over to company microservice, src, main, and under resources, I'm going to create a new file over here. So this is going to be the application K8s properties file. So I'm going to say application -K8s dot properties. And I'm going to paste the entire file. All right. So this is the configuration that we are setting for the company microservice to run in Kubernetes. Now let us understand what everything means and what are the changes that we have done in this particular file here. So we begin with the definition for service URLs. Okay, and these are the URLs that our application will interact with. So we have defined URL for all three services, and in Kubernetes, you can make use of container names as host names. So that is what we are using. We have specified the port number over here for the company microservice. We have disabled the H2 database, and here you can see I have disabled Eureka. So here I had the URL specified for connecting to Eureka client, but this is something that I have removed, and I have mentioned explicitly over here that I want to disable the Eureka client, and even register with Eureka and fetch registry is set to false over here. The service name is set to company. Now if you scroll down, you will have RabbitMQ configuration over here. Here you have the actuator configuration. So here I'm exposing all the endpoints of actuator. And then you have the Zipkin configuration. So we are specifying the endpoint where we will be sending the tracing data to. And we are mentioning the probability, like the sampling probability or the sampling rate, to 1.0. And then over here, I have the settings for PostgreSQL. So I've defined all of this, and this is a separate configuration which will be used for Kubernetes deployment. Okay. And it has all the configurations that is relevant for Kubernetes. So we don't have Eureka Server. We have disabled Eureka Server. Company microservice didn't have config server configured. Otherwise, we would have got rid of that as well. But these are the changes that we have done so far in company microservice. Hey there, welcome back. So now let us set up the deployment and service configurations for company service. So here you can see I have a notepad where I have defined the deployment as well as the service configurations for company. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire thing. I'll head over to Visual Studio Code, and under Bootstrap folder, I will expand the company folder. So right now I don't have anything within company folder. So I'm going to add a new file over here, and I'm going to call this particular file as company, and I'll say deployment, and I'll add the YAML file here. Then I'll add the company and service. So I'll say company-service.yaml. Now I'll paste everything into deployment file, and then I'll copy or cut the service part to company service over here. Okay. And then within deployment file, I'll just get rid of this end part here. I'll just delete this. And if I scroll up here, I'll get rid of this as well. And I'll save both the files. So don't forget to save here. So I have deployment configuration and the service configuration set for company. Now let us go through and understand what each thing means over here. So here in deployment file, we begin with the specification like API version, the kind of object we are creating, and the metadata about the object. Now here in metadata, we are specifying the name of the deployment and labels to identify this deployment. Then we have specs that we have defined here. And under specs, we have things like replicas, template, and spec again. Okay. And then we have selector too. So under replicas, we are mentioning how many replicas of a particular pod we want to be running. So we keep this to 1. Template defines the pod's specification. So here we are saying the name is company and this is the name of the pod. And the label we have is app:company, and this is to identify the pod. Now, if you scroll down here, we have the specifications and we are specifying the containers over here. So this is the list of containers that will run within the pod. And we have specified the container name as company, which has this particular image and it runs on this particular port over here. So these are the ports that are exposed from the container. So we are exposing 8081. And then we are specifying the environment property over here or environment variable of the container. And the value we are passing in is K8s because the properties file that we have created is -K8s. And then we have the restart policy over here. So restart policy says always, which means if the container stops, it will always be restarted. And then we have selector defined over here, and this selects the pod with label app:company, ensuring the correct pods are targeted by this deployment. So this is the definition for deployment file. And then we have service file wherein we have the specification like API version, kind of the object, and metadata defined at the top. And then we have the selector defined over here, and this selects the pod with the label app:company. And then we have the port specified over here. So ports mentions the list of the ports that we wish to expose. So we are exposing port 80 to the external clients, and target port 8081 means the port on the container to which the traffic will be routed. Okay. So this is where our application will actually be running. So you can see over here, it's running on 8081. So service is listening on 8080 and it will route the traffic to the 8081 port of the container. So we have specified the type as load balancers, and this will allow external access to the pods. Okay. So this is how we have mentioned the service and the deployment configurations for company object or for the company microservice. Hey there, welcome back. So now it's time to set up the application properties for our review service. And I have already defined the configuration file over here in the notepad. And I'm going to copy this and move this file into our review microservice. So I'll head over to src main resources and I'll create a new application.properties file over here. So I'll say application -K8s. So this is the application.properties file for Kubernetes. So we'll specify that over here. And then I'll paste in whatever I have copied. Now let us go through this file. So we begin by defining the service URLs. Okay, and these are the URLs wherein we are trying to access the containers with the help of the service names. And with Kubernetes, it is okay to use container names as host names. Then we have the server port defined for the review microservice over here. I have the application name here. We are setting debug level to debug over here. And we have disabled the Eureka server over here. So I'm saying register with Eureka false and fetch registry also false. And I'm disabling this URL over here, the service URL for Eureka. Then here I have the RabbitMQ settings, wherein I am adding some resiliency and I'm configuring the RabbitMQ server. Then here I'm defining the actuator configuration, wherein I'm exposing all the actuator endpoints. And then I have the Zipkin configuration defined here. Now Zipkin configuration defines two things. We have the endpoint for Zipkin and the sampling probability, which is set to 1.0. And then in the end, I have the settings for PostgreSQL database. And here I'm specifying everything like the container, okay, how to access the container or Postgres instance. And then I have username, password along with the database specification over here. So I've specified everything over here, okay, and you can see this is the database name in the end. So this is a file that will be used to work in Kubernetes environment. All right. And this is what we have configured with our project. Hey there, welcome back. So let us set up the configuration for review service, and we are going to define the Kubernetes configuration for this particular service. So here I have a notepad file created, and I have two things in this file. One is the deployment configuration, and here I have the service configuration. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move both these things to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to head over to Bootstrap, review, and I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to say review-deployment, and I'm going to create this as YAML file, and I'm going to create one more file. I'm going to say review-service, like so. Now under deployment, I'll paste whatever I have copied, and I'll cut the last part of the file and I'll move it to service here. Okay. And I'll save this file. Now I'll do some cleanup in the deployment file. So I'll just remove this from here, and then I'll scroll up and I'll remove the deployment heading at the top, and I'll hit save. So we have two files added. One is for deployment and another one is for service. So you can see over here, it begins with the general information like the API version, the kind of the object that we are creating. So deployment in our case. And then we have metadata specified. And this is the metadata about the object, like the name and the label. Then we have spec defined. And spec contains the specification for deployment. So we have the replicas configured here. So we want only one replica for this particular deployment. Template, we have the template definition for this particular pod. And then we have the container definition for this particular pod. And here you can see we are pulling in our image. This is the container name. We have the image pull policy. And we are also specifying the environment as to how we are supposed to run this microservice. And here in the end, we are adding a match label. Then in the review service, I'm creating a service object wherein I've specified some information as to the API version, the kind of the object, and the metadata, which defines the name of its service. Then I have the specification of the service. So I say selector is app:/review, and this specifies which pod the service should direct traffic to based on their labels. And in this case, those with label app:/review is where the service directs the traffic. So here you can see we have defined the label here. And then we have the port information. So here we have mentioned the protocol, and 80 is the port that service listens on, and the target port is 8083 where the traffic is forwarded to. And this should match the server's port in our case. Okay. So this is the thing that we have specified for review. So here one small change I'll do. So here we are forwarding to 8083. So here I'll add container port as 8083 because that is where the traffic is being forwarded to. And I'll hit save. So this is the configuration that we have defined for our review service to be deployed and running on Kubernetes cluster.